Imagine, if you can, a December 25th where the church bells are silent. There are no wreaths on the doors, no stockings hung by the chimney, and the smell of roasting turkey is conspicuously absent. The streets are not filled with well-wishers, but with men and women trudging to work in the bitter cold, heads down, ignoring the date entirely. Imagine that if you were caught resting, or worse, feasting with your family, you wouldn't just be frowned upon, you would be fined, shamed, and treated as a criminal. This isn't a dystopian fiction, or a scene from a grim fantasy novel. This was Boston, Massachusetts, in the middle of the 17th century. We often hear phrases like "the war on Christmas" tossed around in modern cable news cycles, referring to coffee cup designs or holiday greetings. But the true war on Christmas was fought nearly 400 years ago, and it was waged by the very people we associate with the founding of America, the Puritans. To the Puritan founders of New England, Christmas was not the most wonderful time of the year. It was a hateful, blasphemous abomination. It was a day that represented everything they had fled England to escape. The corruption of the Catholic Church, the pagan roots of ancient Rome, and the drunken disorder of the English working class. So how did the holiday we cherish today become a crime punishable by law? And why did it take generations for Christmas to return to New England? To understand this, we have to step inside the mind of the Puritan, a mind that saw the devil hiding in a sprig of holly. To understand why the Puritans banned Christmas, we first have to understand their obsession with purity. The very name Puritan comes from their desire to purify the Church of England of any practices that lacked clear biblical authority. They were people of the book. If it wasn't in the scripture, they didn't want it. And here was the problem with Christmas. Nowhere in the Bible is a date given for the birth of Jesus. The Gospels of Luke and Matthew describe the event, but they offer no calendar date. In fact, the Puritans argued, quite correctly, that shepherds would not be out in the fields watching their flocks by night in the dead of winter in Judea. To them, celebrating December 25th was a lie. It was a human invention, not a divine ordinance. But it was worse than just a lie. It was a Popish invention. The Puritans viewed the hierarchy of the Catholic Church, and by extension the Anglican Church they had left behind, as the Antichrist. They believed that the Pope had arbitrarily chosen December 25th to overwrite pagan festivals. And they were right about the history. The Puritans were well educated. They knew their history. They knew that long before the birth of Christ, late December was the time of the winter solstice. It was the time of Saturnalia in Rome, a week-long festival of lawlessness, gambling, and feasting. It was the time of Yule in the Germanic tradition. The early church had adopted this date to make the transition easier for pagans converting to Christianity. To a Puritan, this was unacceptable. You could not take a pagan idol, sprinkle some holy water on it, and call it Christian. As the Reverend Increase Mather, a prominent Boston minister, later wrote, "Men dishonor Christ more in the 12 days of Christmas than in all the 12 months besides." To them, keeping the holiday was akin to worshiping Baal. It was idolatry, plain and simple. However, the objection wasn't purely theological. It was also social. If you look at how Christmas was celebrated in England in the 1600s, it looks nothing like our modern, domestic, family-centered holiday. It looked more like Mardi Gras. In England, Christmas was a time of misrule. The social order was inverted. The poor would demand entry into the homes of the rich. They would go wassailing, which sounds quaint in a carol, but in reality often involved groups of young, intoxicated men banging on doors, demanding food and ale, and vandalizing property if they were refused. There was gambling. There was card playing. There was public drunkenness and sexual licentiousness. For the Puritans, who were trying to build a city upon a hill, a model of order, discipline, and piety, this kind of behavior was a threat to the very fabric of their society. They believed that idleness was the devil's workshop. A holiday that encouraged people to stop working and start drinking, was not just a nuisance. It was a spiritual danger. When the Pilgrims first spent their first Christmas in Plymouth in 1620, they spent it building the first structure of their colony. Governor William Bradford noted with pride that no man rested all that day. A year later, when some new arrivals to the colony tried to take the day off to play games in the street, Bradford confiscated their gaming equipment and sent them back to their homes. He told them that his conscience would not let them play while others worked. The message was clear. In this new world, there was no room for the old vices. For the first few decades of settlement, the disapproval of Christmas was just that, social pressure. It wasn't explicitly illegal, but it was heavily discouraged. If you celebrated, you were an outsider. You were looked upon with suspicion. But as the colony grew and as more non-Puritans, fishermen, tradesmen, and people less zealous in their faith began to arrive, the leaders of the Massachusetts Bay Colony felt they needed to codify their beliefs into law. They needed to build a wall around their culture to protect it from the creeping influence of English tradition. In 1659, the General Court of Massachusetts passed a law that is shocking to modern ears. The text was blunt and direct. It read, "For preventing disorders arising in several places within this jurisdiction, by reason of some still observing such festivals as were superstitiously kept in other countries, to the great dishonor of God and offense of others, it is therefore ordered, that whosoever shall be found observing any such day as Christmas or the like, either by forbearing of labor, feasting, or any other way, shall pay for every such offense 5 shillings, 5 shillings. That was not a small amount of money in 1659. It was roughly a day's wages for a skilled artisan. The law was clear. Forbearing of labor was the crime. Simply taking the day off was a punishable offense. Town criers, the news broadcasters of their day, walked through the settlements reminding the people, "No Christmas. No Christmas." For the next 22 years, this was the law of the land. Schools remained open. Courts remained in session. Shops were expected to conduct business as usual. We have records of neighbors spying on neighbors. If smoke was coming from your chimney for too long, or if you were seen baking a mince pie, a traditional Christmas treat, you could be reported. The mince pie, rich with spices and dried fruits, was viewed as particularly suspicious because of its association with Anglican feasting. So what changed? Did the Puritans suddenly find their holiday spirit? Not quite. The end of the ban didn't come from within. It was forced upon them from across the ocean. In England, the Puritan movement had its own rise and fall. They had executed King Charles I and ruled under Oliver Cromwell, who also banned Christmas in England. But by 1660, the monarchy was restored under Charles II. The king was not fond of the stiff-necked Puritans in Massachusetts who acted as if they were independent of the crown. Pressure began to mount. The king wanted the laws of the colonies to align with the laws of England. In 1681, after years of political wrangling, the Massachusetts Bay Colony was forced to repeal the anti-Christmas law. It was a humiliation for the Puritan leadership. They felt they were letting the devil back into their sanctuary. But just because the law was off the books didn't mean the culture changed overnight. Laws can be repealed in a day. Traditions take generations to shift. Even after 1681, Christmas in Boston remained a taboo subject. Judge Samuel Sewall, famous for his role in the Salem witch trials, wrote in his diary on Christmas Day in 1685, 4 years after the repeal. He noted with great satisfaction that the carts were coming into town with wood, the shops were open, and the people were working. He wrote, "The body of the people profane it, and blessed be God, no authority yet to compel them to keep it." He was happy that, although it wasn't illegal, the people still chose to ignore the holiday. This anti-Christmas sentiment in New England was incredibly durable. While the American South, settled largely by Anglicans, celebrated Christmas with gusto throughout the 18th century, New England remained cold and dark on December 25th. It wasn't until the mid-19th century, nearly 200 years after the ban, that Christmas became a mainstream holiday in Boston. And it took a rebranding of the holiday to make it happen. The rowdy, drunken, community-based holiday of Old England had to die out. It was replaced by the domestic, child-centered holiday popularized by Queen Victoria, Charles Dickens, and the poem A Visit from St. Nicholas. Once Christmas became about family, children, and charity, rather than drinking and misrule, the descendants of the Puritans could finally accept it. In 1856, Christmas finally became a public holiday in Massachusetts. But even then, some older folks grumbled about popery and the decline of morals. So the next time you feel overwhelmed by the commercialism of the season or the pressure to buy the perfect gift, take a moment to remember the Puritans of 1659. They wanted a world of pure silence on December 25th. They fought a war to keep Christmas out, and for a brief, shivering moment in history, they won. But the human desire for light in the darkness, for feasting in the winter, and for joy in the face of the cold, proved to be a force that not even the General Court of Massachusetts could legislate away.